The commemoration on September 29th, 1966, of the Jews murdered during World War II at the Babyn Yar began as usual. Several hundred Jews, carrying flowers and memorial wreaths, gathered at the notorious ravine on the outskirts of Kyiv. They came to pay tribute to some 33,771 Kyivans of Jewish origins shot dead by the Nazis in late September 1941 and thrown into the Babyn Yar. The unexpected arrival of leading Ukrainian literary figures on that September day galvanized those assembled at the Mount Granite Slab. The fact that the prominent non-Jewish cultural figures had come to commemorate the Jewish victims, a thing that had never happened before, made a strong impression. For dozens of national-minded Ukrainians and Jewish activists, this encounter between Ukrainian literary figures of dissident origin or of nationalist convictions and the Jews who came to commemorate the victims was the momentum of Ukrainian Jewish rapprochement. One of the guests was Ivan Dziuba, then a prominent Ukrainian literary figure and a dissident. He gave an improvised keynote speech which appeared after the event in various copies and was widely circulated in the Ukrainian samizdat. Addressing the Kyivan Jews, Dziuba outlined the parameters of the Ukrainian Jewish encounter back then in 1966. He spoke of the shared historical fate of the Ukrainians and the Jews, victims of Russian and Soviet colonialism, enforced denationalization and Russification. Popularizing heretofore not widely known information about the encounter between Ivan Franko, a key Ukrainian writer and poet, and Theodor Herzl, Dziuba brought up examples of the sympathy of important Jewish writers toward the Ukrainians and of the founders of Ukrainian literature toward the Jews. Most of the Jews who gathered that day at the Babyn Yar were very familiar with the stories of long-lasting Ukrainian Jewish animosity, and the examples which Dziuba presented were a revelation to them. Dziuba told Ukrainians what they need to know about the Jews and what Jews need to know about Ukrainians. For his speech, Dziuba was under KGB arrest and then under the ban on exercising his profession for several years. He did return to Jewish themes several times during his career, but he never got a chance to think through the intellectual, cultural, and yes, human premises of his talk. But he gave birth to a genealogy of ideas that brought Jews and Ukrainians together in the form of a parallel narrative with bifurcating paths. The book, Jews and Ukrainians, this book that my very much esteemed co-author Paul Robert Magocsi and I wrote, belongs in precisely this cultural genealogy. What the new book contributes started exactly 50 years ago. Writing this book, co-authoring it, was also an instructive process. One of the crucial things I learned is that what Jews need to know about Ukrainians and what Ukrainians need to know about the Jews is basically one and the same thing, the same set of ideas. Ignorance makes people similar, but turn them into enemies. Knowledge makes people different, but brings them together for a conversation. Jews and Ukrainians is an attempt to overcome mutual ignorance, provide some basic knowledge, and bring Jews and Ukrainians together for a conversation. Not only does the book tell Jews about Ukrainians and Ukrainians about Jews, it tells Jews about Jews and Ukrainians about Ukrainians. But why do Jews and Ukrainians need all that? Because representatives of both people know as little about themselves as they know about the other. You can laugh. The ignorance on both sides is astounding. Jews do not know that Ukraine was home to great rabbinic scholars, Hebrew and Yiddish writers, and major Jewish thinkers and politicians, to ideas and concepts that govern Jewish life to the present day. Ukrainians do not know that Jews made Ukrainian villages into towns and towns into cities, developed the Ukrainian market economy, and inspired key Ukrainian thinkers to think differently about Ukraine. In addition, both Ukrainians and Jews are ignorant of the fact that Jews and Ukrainians in Odesa are cosmopolitan, in Kryviy Rih and Dnipro, business-oriented, in Donetsk and Luhansk, Russia-oriented, and in central and western Ukraine they celebrate Ukrainian-oriented cultural identities. Ukrainians do not know that Ivan Dziuba was actually inspired by Zeev Jabotinsky and read his articles. Jews do not know that Nathan Birnbaum, the guy who invented the word Zionism, was inspired by the Galician movement of Ruthenian revival. Ukrainians do not realize that Jesus was Jewish. Jews do not realize that Tevye the milkman was Ukrainian. Jews ignorant of their own history and culture look and sound very similar to Ukrainians who are ignorant of their own culture and history. The person who says that Ukrainians were killing Jews during World War II is as ignorant as the person who says that Jews brought communism to Ukraine. Both statements prey on reductionism and generalization. Of course, there were individual members of the Ukrainian auxiliary police together with Hungarians, Romanians, Poles, and Russians. There were many communists of Jewish descent active in Ukraine together with communist Russians, Georgians, Poles, Germans, and Ukrainians active in Ukraine at the same time. But one cannot take several individuals for an entire people. That would be too easy and comforting. Knowledge starts when people ask questions to avoid easy, comforting, and simplified answers. This book on Ukrainians and Jews seeks to bring the people together, two people together, by creating a realm of knowledge between them, a bridge over a dangerous abyss of ignorance, reductionism, and generalizations. The authors of this book, Bob, I am talking about you now, and me. Don't get asleep, okay? The authors of this book are two very different people, yes. Paul Robert Magocsi was born in the United States and raised in a Protestant family of Central European origin. Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern was born and raised in the Soviet Union by a family of Jewish origin, although in a totally secular environment and absolutely ignorant of his roots whatsoever. However, in addition to their shared professional interest in Ukraine, there was an important moral factor that brought the two authors together. Both authors were committed to overturning generalizations, to shunning reductionism, and to seeking new knowledge about the two peoples. Moreover, and most importantly, they were convinced that only a people who knows thyself can understand and respect the other. The book, Jews and Ukrainians, gives precisely the type of knowledge that teaches self-respect and respect for different people living in our midst. Hence, the book is based on the key idea of knowing thyself as a member of a people, as an individual related to that people. Understanding difference requires sometimes something more than received wisdom. Most Jews know about Ukrainians precisely what Ukrainians know about Jews. Received wisdom. That is to say, stereotypes. Jews were the lackeys of the Polish Szlachta and magnates and subservient agents of the Bolsheviks. They were behind the Russian Revolution and they were Russian-oriented, staunch Ukrainophobes. They may not have masterminded the Holodomor, but some Jews certainly did, and they continue blaming Ukrainians worldwide for the World War II atrocities Ukrainians neither initiated nor carried out. They sent their agent to kill one of the key founders of the first Ukrainian independent state, Symon Petliura, chief Ottoman of the Ukrainian People's Republic. For Jews, in turn, Ukraine was the center of the European bloodlands from the time immemorial. Jewish history in Ukraine was one prolonged pogrom. Ukrainians are Jew haters like nobody else in East Europe, worse than the Poles. They killed Jews en masse during the Cossack rebellions, Haidamach massacres, revolutionary upheavals of the early 20th century, and during the first Ukrainian short-lived political independence. Furthermore, the 300 years from the 1640s till the 1940s show that whenever Ukraine becomes independent, it turns virulently anti-Semitic and kills the Jews. And in times of peace, it tends to erase all traces of evil it did to its Jews. Such stereotypes are passed from generation to generation through oral history, legends, family stories. They are sometimes inspired by political propaganda, not always of Jewish or Ukrainian making. These stereotypes are powerful, entrenched, and taken for absolute, obvious, and undeniable truth. Questioning this truth is tantamount to leaving or betraying ethnic self-identity. Any discussion of Ukrainian-Jewish relations has these stereotypical views in the background. Whoever works in the Ukrainian Jewish historical field has to keep in mind that the interlocutor is always ready to say, "Really? This is not what I have heard." Precisely here enters the historian. To question a stereotype, to discuss the nuances, to introduce complexity into the discussion. Not necessarily to dismiss stereotypes as altogether false. A historian begins with questioning, with questions challenging generalizations. You are saying that Ukraine was a land of martyrdom for the Jews. Why then was it home to a quarter of world Jewry, and why did Jews keep moving until the end of the 19th century to Ukraine, not out of it? Well, Ukrainian nationalists were allegedly staunch anti-Semites. How about the people such as Yaroslav Dashkevich, Miroslav Marinovich, Yevhen Sverstyuk, Zinovy Antonyuk, etc., accused by the Soviet regime precisely of Ukrainian nationalism? Why did these people champion Ukrainian Jewish rapprochement and defend the Jews as an ethnic group with a unique culture to the xenophobic Soviet authorities? Why were they the very people who inspired assimilated Jewish dissidents in the Gulag to look at themselves as representatives of the Ukrainian Jews with a strong national democratic agenda? Nobody denies that Lazar Kaganovych, one of the closest agents of Stalin, together with party leaders of Ukrainian, Russian, and Belarusian descent, helped transform a moment of collectivization into a state-orchestrated famine in Ukraine. Yes, he spoke Yiddish and considered himself a communist. But wait, was there any constituency that voted for him as a Jew? Did he represent any Jewish group or party? Was he treated by his party colleagues as a Jew, and did he see himself as a defender of any kind of Jewish interests? He never did, in fact, and always considered himself a communist, not a Jew, as everybody did among the elites in the class-based state, the Soviet Union. And as an ethnicity-less communist, he was responsible for introducing the Ukrainization of Soviet Ukraine in 1924, something that most historians prefer to forget. Stereotypes are not only misleading, they are dangerous as they govern, people's decision-making. Questioning stereotypes makes people revisit their patterns of behavior and modes of thinking. Questions can be unsettling and quite challenging. Take the example of the 1919 pogroms, for which Symon Petliura, the chief Ottoman of the Ukrainian People's Republic, is often blamed. Well, to orchestrate mass violence against any ethnicity, one has to have power over a territory where a targeted minority lives. Loyal troops following commands to commit atrocities and trained to do so. Political, religious, or ideological motivation channeled to the troops, and so on. But here, a historian comes and tells you that Petliura had done none of these, and had had none of these. That his power stretched perhaps over a railroad through which his train moved between Kyiv and Fastiev. and that he himself was a staunch Semite who had defended Jews against Russian anti-Semites before 1917 and who had taken Jews into the Ukrainian government and promoted them to positions of influence after 1917. What would you say about Petliura's responsibility for the mass violence against Jews in the territory of Ukraine in 1919? This book about Jews and Ukrainians does give an answer. But it also invites disagreement and debate. It invites you to think and talk about hot issues in a new framework in which words burn but do not wound. It took hundreds of books, articles, newspapers, unpublished documents to write this book. And yet this book is a footnote-free narrative. It might seem an easy read, but it is often puzzling and unsettling. It appears like an encyclopedic book about the national geography, ethnic and cultural complexity, historical experiences, literary and artistic specificities, linguistic and religious differences of Ukrainians and Jews in or from Ukraine, but the book also has logic, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit. It unsettles the reader's stereotypical perception of the subject matter, challenges their expectations and offers an alternative narrative on each and every cultural or historical aspect of Ukrainians and Jews. It does so by introducing complexities, inviting nuances, and teaching the reader to question his or her own stereotypes. It does so by constructing a balanced and instructive history. It turns out that there were at least three different trends in Judaism among Jews in Ukraine, and 5 trends in Christianity among Ukrainians. Ethnic Ukrainians and ethnic Jews spoke at least 4 different languages in different parts of Ukraine. There were both Ukrainians and Jews in Ukraine who identified with the Russian Empire or Russian Federation, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth or Republic of Poland, the Habsburg Empire, and were both Ukrainians and Jews who were committed or not committed to Ukrainian political independence. Yes, this book is informative, like some uninventive Wikipedia article, but it also teaches. Its major methodology is that of offering ways to look above and beyond familiar stereotypes. Then, it turns out that Jews and Ukrainians share much more than ignorance of one another. What they share is at the center of the book. The story told by this book is not immediately evident as you start reading from chapter on history through the chapter on diasporas and the contemporary situation. Trust me, the story is there. The story of the book unravels so that the readers will realize that Jews and Ukrainians are highly heterogeneous people with a shared narrative. Jews and Ukrainians more often than not were agents of somebody else's colonialism and also victims of that colonialism. Quite often Ukrainians and Jews were hideously turned against one another and commissioned, so to speak, to produce mutual hatred. Oh, they know how to do that. But the cultural elites of the two peoples and also ordinary Ukrainians and Jews managed to build solid relations that challenged this imposed hatred. Yes, Ukrainians and Jews were different socially and economically, but their cultural activity in art, music, and literature produced hybrid forms in addition to salient interest in one another. The best anti-colonialist essays about Ukrainian language and culture were written in the early 1900s by Zev Jabotinsky, the founder of revisionist Zionism trend. The Anthem of Kyiv was composed by Igor Shamo, a journalist and musician of Jewish origin and with Ukrainian roots. The first person to speak and write about the Babyn Yar as the place of a Jewish massacre was Mykola Bazhan, the great Ukrainian poet. And the first person to call the Ukrainian famine a genocide was Roman Lemkin, a Jew of Galician background, an international lawyer who introduced the concept. The book has many more examples of bifurcated Ukrainian Jewish histories and cultures, some of which were unexpected discoveries even for the authors. This book is much more than a story of 2 neighboring peoples who lived together and apart for a millennium. Over the last 25 years, Jews and Ukrainians in Ukraine revolutionized their self-understanding. The existence of the State of Israel had played a formidable role in this revolutionary process. Both peoples, Ukrainians and Jews, realized that the attempt to know their own history, culture, religion, and language was at least frowned upon and often simply suppressed before the 1990s in Ukraine. Both people regained their desire to explore their past and to build a common future. Both people realized that their common future depends on their ability to understand and respect one another as full citizens in a democratic polity. And both peoples found that they must actively oppose multiple attempts to negate their right as a distinct polity, language, and culture. Neo-imperialistic policy toward Ukraine seeks to reduce the country to some of the ugly stereotypes already mentioned. On a political level, the book teaches how to respond to imperialist, Putin, anti-Jewish or anti-Ukrainian propaganda and its widespread cliches. The book teaches how to defend the intellectual, linguistic, cultural sovereignty of a people, and how to build a parallel narrative that brings that sovereign people and its immediate neighbor together, the neighbor who, according to imposed or inherited animosity, had been presented as an enemy alien. In this sense, this book is not only about Jews and Ukrainians. It is as much about Ukrainians and Poles, Poles and Germans, Chinese and Indians, Tutsis and Hutus, Turks and Armenians, as it is about Jews and Ukrainians. In this sense, the book teaches the responsibility, our intellectual responsibility, to know the other. When the book was conceived, the idea was to write 10-11 chapters covering different aspects of the two peoples, including history and modern politics, popular culture, languages, literature and art, theater and music, religious and diasporic life, etc. Of course, one could find several other aspects not covered in the book. Yet, in the process of writing the book, it turned out that the authors both sought to present a comprehensive portrayal of a people in its complexity. After all, in his speech at the Babyn Yar, Ivan Dziuba spoke about national histories and perceptions, national literary figures who talk about one another and turn to one another as a theme, about the prejudice and stereotype, about the colonial situation, and about what people can learn from one another. This approach signified that one cannot reduce a people to its political history, let alone to its stories of victimization. People believe in God or do not believe. They go to the church, to this church, and never set a foot in that one. They write and read, they educate their children and themselves. They eat and celebrate holidays, they build their dwellings, watch performances, listen to music, and pursue different careers. It is impossible to reduce people to just one of these aspects. The book on Jews and Ukrainians thus teaches a multifaceted approach as the only one possible when we talk about a people or an ethnic group or a nation. Some Ukrainians like borscht and sing in a choir, but many more do not. Some Jews like talking about anti-Semitism and eat lox and bagels, but many more Jews talk only about anti-Semitism and eat only lox and bagels. The point is that people can be seen as individuals and need to be assessed in the complexity of their actions. This book on Jews and Ukrainians is a textbook on how to think or write about a people, any people. Of course, people live in a certain habitat. Ukrainians in Ukraine and Jews in Ukraine share this habitat. This is the territory of Ukraine in its historical boundaries and beyond these boundaries. The authors of the book decided to go beyond the ethnocentric narratives, putting them in a comparative framework based on shared geography. This book, Ukraine is understood first and foremost as a shared territory with its own history and culture. Ukrainians performed specific and unique role in the history and culture of this territory. Jews performed a function too. But there were other peoples. There were Greeks, Genovese Italians, Crimean Tatars, Romanians, Germans, Czech Mennonites, Poles, and, of course, Russians. They must all be brought back to the study of the Ukrainian history. Thus, Ukrainian history and culture is and has always been multi-ethnic, not only about Jews and Ukrainians. Dziuba's attempt to talk about the Ukrainian Jewish aspect of this culture and history at the Babyn Yar in 1966 cost him dearly. For his public denunciations of anti-Ukrainian and anti-Semitic persecution, Dziuba became the victim of political persecution in his own right. In 1966, his attempt to talk about Ukrainians and Jews brought on his head the wrath of the state apparatus and ruling party organs. The authors of this book, Paul Robert Magocsi and Yohanan Petrovsky-Shtern, are blessed with a very different environment, and I hope different feedback. I just wanted us to remember that there were dozens of people who came before us to think through these issues, but who were absolutely unable to bring them to the book format. I would like to think of them as co-authors who contributed to the final project, teaching us about curiosity toward the other as part of our own self-respect. Thank you.